Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the fourth webinar as part of the African City Food Exchange and African City Food Month. My name is Paul Curry. I'm the manager of the Urban Systems Unit at ICLEI Africa, and it's my pleasure to be facilitating our conversation on where chemistry, storytelling, and policy collide, reflecting on lessons from the Inclusive Metabolism project. This webinar is part of the African City Food Month, which is brought to you by ICLEI Africa, the African Centre for Cities, Ricolto, RUAF, the South African Urban Food and Farming Trust, and the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact. And the aim is to share actions about improving urban food systems across the continent. Today, we are having a conversation which is about adding to questions about the science and policy interface and thinking about how we direct integrated or transdisciplinary research into policy actions that decision makers or stakeholders working in the food system can reflect upon and take on. So after a brief welcome and context from me, we'll hand over to my colleague Sandra Boatema, who will reflect on the water, energy and food nexus for sustainable cities, and share reflections from some of the research on resource security in households in African cities. We'll take a step to our colleagues in Kumasi, Mercy Badu and her postdoc Abigail, to reflect on food safety in Kumasi, from chemical analysis to policy recommendations. We'll then come to Cape Town, and Sean Ali Mohammadi will reflect on a food garden experiment that was done in Cape Town, and what implications this may mean, how experimentation can improve our understanding of what is possible in shaping our food systems, before we reflect on imagery from across the continent from our colleague Jahan Biku, who will reflect on the Hidden Flows photo showcase and share some reflections on how the photography and the stories captured in these photographs can inform policy. We'll then have a conversation and a reflection together, and do invite those who've joined us to add your thoughts. So in thinking about how to introduce this discussion, I thought I would reflect on the buzzword, or the often used word, of transdisciplinary research or integrated research. And it's become something that is challenging our traditional models of rather extractive research by demanding that there is value addition for the beneficiaries of your research that's made directly as part of your research process. So instead of focusing on very disciplinary work, which is one discipline trying to solve an issue, towards multidisciplinary, which is multiple different types of ways of knowing, looking at the same problem, to interdisciplinary work, which is about cross-learning between the disciplines who are trying to address a challenge, towards transdisciplinarity, which is about working with society and those working in society to do the research together. And in that way, there's a sense that the research will have more ownership in communities or policy arenas, and is more likely to be appropriate to the context and be taken up by those working in that area. So by way of introduction in the chat, can I invite you to introduce yourself and where you're from, and perhaps what interested you in this conversation, and perhaps what do you consider important for effective research to be taken up into action or policy. Some of the principles that we think about for transdisciplinary research include collaboration with multiple stakeholders, again, not only seeing them as beneficiaries to offer you information for you to digest separately, but being part of the process, and thereby having shared value creation, having research with the beneficiaries, as I said, and then interestingly, how do you bring together multiple ways of knowing to create new knowledge or new ways of working? And that's what is most exciting about reflecting on this project together, is there really have been different ways of approaching this research in different contexts and using different disciplines. for a last sentence, just to reflect on what the Inclusive Metabolism Project is it's effectively revolving around three ideas. It's thinking about how the concept of urban metabolism, which is about how resources come into a city, are digested in the city to create economic production and hopefully some social well-being with that, and then how those wastes leave the city. And thinking about how in African cities, so much of the resources that support the city aren't tracked. We don't have data about it. And we know that the informal sector does a lot to move resources. So thinking about the connections between urban metabolism and informal or hidden actors who are moving resources that are really important in the city. And then reflecting on what food systems research could offer to thinking about water security and energy security. And there's a very sophisticated set of pillars about what food security is. And so thinking about how those can support a more subtle way of thinking about water and energy security. Thinking not just about whether it's available, but what are the things that allow people to access that resource? What quality is that resource in? And how resilient is it to shocks? How stable is that resource? And more recently thinking about what agency people have to affect, in this case, the food system or the resource system, and how that resource system can be made more sustainable and improve the environment that it's interacting with. And finally, to put our boundaries, to acknowledge that there are multiple ways of knowing and understanding the city. We wanted to try a research approach that, yes, looked at literature and what people in academia were voicing, but also to meet with stakeholders, market workers on the ground, and engage them about how they experience the resource system, and then to reflect more widely about how citizens are interacting with the system. And so they're having surveys, having photographs, and a whole photography or photo narrative process, which Jahan will share on. So in this webinar, we have designed it as a bit of a loose conversation to reflect on what's coming out of these different types of research and how they are each contributing to policy. So I'm looking forward to this conversation very much. And I'd like to invite our colleague Sandra to take us through the initial reflections on food, water, energy nexus.
Thank you very much, Paul. And thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. As Paul has already indicated.
Sandra, will you share your video?
Yes, please. Okay. Thank you. Can you see me?
Yes, and we can see your screen.
Okay, thank you very much. It's just wonderful to be connecting from Accra this morning. The Inclusive Metabolism Project was started in 2019 with funding from the International Science Council through NASAC. And we've been having this project for the past 3 years in Cape Town and then in Kumasi. So we had separate components of work, as Paul mentioned. And the first component of work was to look at the literature that has been published on African cities and how key resources are shared across these cities among households in particular. And the reasons why we were actually very interested in urbanization in cities is because we've noticed that globally, urban areas are becoming larger and larger. And actually projections indicate that we're going to have approximately 50 or 70% of populations by 2050 living in urban areas. These huge numbers in urban areas has a huge implication for environmental sustainability, for even economic and social welfare. So doing studies or doing urban research in this particular time is important for addressing issues of poverty, energy, water, and food insecurity across cities. Even though urbanization has been with us since 2000s and coming up, what we've seen is that cities struggle to achieve both food, energy, water, and transportation security. When you look at all the resources that cities are using, security of these resources, supply systems cannot be assured. And you notice that a lot of cities struggle because they have mandates that address these issues from a single perspective. So you would have a city authority that responds to only water, city authority that responds to only energy, or a city authority that responds to only food without any cross-sectorial connections and interactions between these stakeholders who are involved in providing resources for urban areas. So there's a concept called water, energy, food nexus. And this concept is basically talking about how to integrate, the services or provision of these three systems to provide services in a way that's sustainable and also, support environmental sustainability. The main goal of using the WEF nexus is to think about interconnectedness between these systems, how water affects food, how food even affects water, how energy even affects water production, and how all these different systems come together to support the provision of services in urban areas in a more sustainable way. So for the first part of our research, what we wanted to do was to look at African cities and to see how these resources are provided for residents of urban areas and how these services are sustained, and how people experience these resources within their households and their communities. For water, we focused on the main source of water for household use. We chose this because a lot of the water that is used in urban areas is actually for household use versus household consumption, versus drinking water. And when you come to source of water for household use, you have different forms and modes that exist compared to drinking water, where you can only find either bottled water or sachet water. And for energy, we decided to focus on the main source of energy for cooking and for lighting. And for food production, we tried to review papers that have been published that describe own production and then market purchases. In 2019, we did a systematic review and we looked at PubMed, we did Science Direct, we did Scopus, and then the Web of Science. So we did this search between 2019, November, and January 2020. When you look at the flow diagram that I have here, through our search, we identified almost 6,100 papers. And after removing the duplicates, we had about 18,050. So we screened our materials based on how they responded to urban problems. So for example, for the water, we were not looking at papers that describe, technical issues. For example, if a dam had been built and what machines were used on the dam, what kind of chemical analysis has been conducted on the water, we did not look at those. We just looked at papers that describe how households access these resources within their households. By the time we finished with the screening, we had about a total of 100 papers to review for our research. So we did analysis using the narrative synthesis approach recommended by the UK ESRC. And this approach talks about tabulation using textual summaries and thematic analysis of the materials that are available to you. We use Adlai's TI to organize the themes and the quotes that we found in the review. And for the review in particular, we used a food security perspective. So, when you think about food security, the main components are food availability, food accessibility, food utilization. And so we use these terms to look at water availability in households, water accessibility in households, and then even water utilization within households. First of all, for this particular presentation, we would focus on characterizing urban resource supply. So when we look at water, which is the first resource that we found, we noticed that for actually all these three resources, they are provided through formal and informal networks. And this is what we really want to highlight, because when you think about resource supply using an urban metabolism approach, mainly you would see that the focus is on the formal systems and how these systems are mapped or can be tracked in urban areas. But we noticed from our work that there's a lot of informal vendors who are supplying these resources. So for example, for water, we found that it is through either people accessing water through wells, whether covered or uncovered, through boreholes, through rivers, and also through rainwater. So some households were harvesting rainwater for their household consumption. For formal source of water, we had pipe water, and it's either piped into their homes or public pipe stands. One thing that was also very interesting was water vendors. And these water vendors could be tankers or people who, trucks that move about with gallons. In their households doing household water delivery services. And it's interesting for us because even though they are accessing a formal source of water, the delivery or the actual service is being provided by an informal vendor. For all of these, for all of these sources of water supply, you would notice that with the rainwaters, residents will experience shortage in supply because of droughts. And in Africa recently, with climate change and issues, we've had flooding issues that are destroying water and river bodies. You've had unpredictable rainfall patterns. So those who depend on these sources of water could not actually have access to this water all the time. When it comes to the pipe water, you'd find that there's infrequent supply because the companies or the water companies were rationing these resources across households. So even in a place like Bachi in Ethiopia, you'd find that 73% of households, in Nigeria, were having access to piped water. The coverage was 73%. In Addis Ababa, you had 84%. In Yaoundé, you have 65%. These numbers are really nice, but it's just coverage, whether you have or you don't have piped water. But when you ask the question, do you, when we read a paper and we looked at households that had consistent supply of water, the numbers from 75 to 65 actually reduces further to about 23% of households in urban areas having access to water frequently from the formal source. So for most of the households, their supplies were coming from the informal sector. When it comes to looking at world dynamics, it was obvious that some of the former suppliers actually were biased against urban poor communities. So in Kibera, I think in Nairobi, during a particular period where the government was running a program, every year, disconnections happened in Kibera. And it's like a government intervention, particularly affecting the flow of a resource within a poor community. In terms of those who have the resources, you would see that we noticed that from the papers that we read, the tankers, the water vendors were being used by the urban rich households to access these formal resources. What this means is that for the poor and the informal who could not provide or access these informal services had to rely on either the wells, the boreholes, or the rainwater systems for their supply, which, as I mentioned earlier, were inconsistent due to seasonal droughts and unreliable rainfall patterns. But the good thing about the informal was that it provided a business opportunity. And whenever you wanted it, you could always call the vendor and request for a supply. We also looked at energy. So we looked at these three resources. When you look at energy supply in these urban areas, for fuel, the main dominant source of cooking fuel at the informal sector was charcoal and firewood. And then some households had coal, paraffin, and candles. And because of the effects of these, the smokes that comes with it, you'd have respiratory infections, high respiratory infections among children in households that use these informal systems. But the coverage is actually very high. For example, in Lome, almost all households in Lome use charcoal or firewood as their main household supply of energy. And then it was also provided a shorter point of sale because the fuel vendor is just your next door neighbor. So you could just walk for about 5 minutes and have a source of energy right in your household. And then for some of these sources of fuel, it was being produced by the households themselves. So there's no need for them to buy it, which was actually very good for their own economic benefits. But the impact of that was on their health which showed respiratory infections. And actually the broader impact on the environment of cutting all these charcoal fuel and harvesting this coal is on environmental degradation and actually causing more erosion in the areas where these trees used to be. When you look at the former energy supply, what we noticed was that it was mainly electricity and LPG. And the other source of energy like ethanol and solar were only complementary, and it was just available in only a few households. For example, for the energy, the companies do not have the ability to supply these provisions, to supply these resources sustainably and consistently, because they either had problems with water levels at the dams or issues with machines that could not be pumped or machines that could not be supported to provide bulk energy to cities that needed a lot of energy within a simple, especially during the rush hours between 7 p.m. and 8 p.m. or 5 p.m. and 9 p.m. when people had come back from work and needed these energy resources for their household consumption.
3 minutes, please, Sandra.
Thank you very much. When it came to food, we noticed that there were several vendors who were providing food. So you get markets, traditional markets, you would get the kiosks, you get the spaza shops, then you have the hawkers, the street food vendors. And then you would have the issue with the informal was that it provided people with a bargaining opportunity where they could bargain on the price of food that was available to them. And if you don't have money, you can actually buy on credit. And the food vendor was just your next door neighbor as well. So the informal provided these services sustainably and consistently to households, but they had issues of food safety and limited variety. What we noticed with the hypermarket, with the former systems were, hypermarkets, supermarkets, convenience stores, and then restaurants, but they were mainly sourcing their food from abroad. It is not sustainable when you think about creating local city food hubs and city food systems. So only in Cape Town, one study counted almost 270 supermarkets in Cape Town. And for the urban reach, the main source of food production or food access was through the formal system. And they provided reliable trading and, social ethics, social prestige was attached to shopping from these formal spaces. So what we noticed from how these three resources are distributed in urban areas is a clear example of exclusion. So urban residents, experience conditions of scarcity and infrastructure deficiencies. We know that also governments were involved in the sector. So some of the governments in cities like Ethiopia, in cities in Nigeria, provided price controls for how these items were supplied to households. And then some countries also prevented foreign direct investments into these areas. So after reading all this work, we were thinking that, okay, probably for cities to become more sustainable in providing these resources and to provide a linkage between these sources, we need to think about partnerships. For example, how can the tankers who supply waters be more supported such that even people who don't have money can access these tankers within their household? And also monitoring of these resources such that pipes don't burst anyhow, or even machines to pump these resources to households don't get broken. So after doing this review, we sat down and asked ourselves, what do we do with our work? And we decided, okay, because of the importance of the informal sector, we would like to do a study of traditional markets. So we went into Kumasi and we surveyed informal vendors who are trading tomatoes and spinach called in Nkontomire in Ghana in that particular area. And we also saw that food safety was a challenge as a result of how they handle their food. So we started to do a microbiological analysis of the food that is being delivered in cities at these markets. And then in Cape Town, we said, okay, why don't we sit back that since food production or food access is mainly through own production or market access, can we look at how own production can influence household food security? And we did that by doing an urban agriculture experiment. And then we said, okay, why don't we have a story of how resources are distributed in urban areas? And through that, with the storytelling and pictorial expressions. So looking at the various actors who are involved in service delivery in urban areas, we worked with Instagram users, we work with academics, we work with vendors, and we work with a variety of stakeholders through a TD approach, so that the views of all these people can be incorporated in addressing the resource use and the interconnectedness of these resources in urban areas. Thank you very much, Paul. Rover.
Thanks very much, Sandra, for the overview, both of the project, but also what the literature is sharing. And just to sort of re-emphasize some of the points made from the review, was that resources are moving both through informal and formal ways. And what's interesting about it is it's not in a segregated manner. It's not as if people living in informal settlements are only using informal means and people living in formal areas are only using formal means, you know, and this interconnection is what's so interesting. And some of the conversation that'll come later is, well, how are we strengthening the linkages between formal and informal, and finding what is working in informal and improving it and what's not. And something that struck me from your presentation here is, when are we supporting the direct value that individuals are getting from a certain resource, even if there's an indirect impact that might come that's unseen, and how do we balance that between then a impact at societal level that's impacting others? So to take us more deeply into Kumasi and the traditional markets, I'd like to invite our colleague Abigail Kwai to present on the work on food security, food safety that was done at KNUST.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to participants. So my name is Abigail Kwai. Sandra mentioned, I'm working here with Dr. Mrs. Mercy Beatty. Okay, so what I did here was to look at the effects of storage and on the quality of the vegetables sold in Kumasi. And I looked at, like Pescon explained, which you all know as tomatoes, and usually in the Western world, it's known as a fruit. However, in Kumasi or in Ghana, as a vegetable.
Hi, Abigail, sorry to interrupt. Your microphone is having a bit of feedback. Just to make sure that we're hearing everything you're saying nicely.
Is it okay?
Yes, let's try again and proceed. Please proceed. We were with you.
Okay, thank you. So once again, there's a major concern to feed a majority of the population. However, the food supply system is sort of failing us. What I would want you to also know that in Kumasi, about 7% of the population can only afford at least 1 meal a day, and the WHO actually recommends that, or strongly recommends that, daily at least about 500 to 800 grams of food should be, taken, and help, reduce risks to cancer, stroke, heart diseases, premature death, and what have you. And what I did too was to look at tomatoes. We all know that tomato is actually a rich source of vitamins, a rich source of nutrients, as well as glucose. However, these tomatoes that we know, or fruits that we know, has the ability to be a microbiological carrier. So what I set out to do was to determine the microbial quality as well as the chemical composition that is in relation with the vegetables during storage and handling. And I specifically isolated and then quantified the microbial. What I did next was to characterize the fungi contaminants that could be present, and also to see how the chemical composition is affected due to the actions of the microbes. So this is a map of my study area. I look at the Oforiko municipality, that is the Aja market, and then the KNS greenhouse due to proximity. And then I also looked at the Kumasi Timor, which is also closer to the greenhouse. From my, you can see the increase in population or the population growth here. They are actually densely populated, which tells you that there is a need or high demand in these areas. What to do with regards to my sampling was to go to the market, which is the Aja market, and as you can see here, just as the vendors had brought them in the box, I did the sorting out. And as I sorted out, I looked out for similar sizes. I looked out for tomatoes that did not have puncture, cuts, whatsoever, bruises, whatsoever. And I did same for vendors at Aja. Then I did one for the greenhouse, the KNS greenhouse, and then the Kumasi City Mall. So these are the 5 vendors that I will be working with. So next, as I mentioned in my objectives, I was looking at the storage facilities. And this is how at the typical markets, especially at Aja market, this is how the vendors display their tomatoes. So we have tomatoes, we have pepper, we have onions, all mixed up. And in a day after they get it from the transportation sites and then it's brought here, what they do is that after display, then they store some in these bowls, as you can see. So then they then leave it after the day ends and then come back the next day and continue with their sales. So what I believe or what we believe here is that these tomatoes are actually being subjected to some sort of environmental conditions. So I decided to look at what environmental conditions are taking place there. And I also saw microorganisms proliferating or be growing there due to the temperature and then the humidity that come along with this storage conditions. So this is for vendor B, as you can see. This is where she also stores still same procedure, pepper, onion, tomatoes, everything mixed up together. For vendor C, this is her storage conditions. And then the last one, which is my control, is the greenhouse. And as you can see, the greenhouse has a very spacious place and everything is sorted out. Tomatoes go to the right container, pepper goes to the right container, any vegetable or specific vegetable goes to the right container. And then you can see from the greenhouse that they have to actually, regulate the temperature in the storage facility. They also have a fan. Probably the air conditioner could fail them at a particular point in time, so they really sorted themselves out. They have ventilation coming from the window, but that's not what we have in the markets. Okay, so in carrying out my microbiological analysis, I had to look out for the presence of microorganisms. So what I have here is a graph that tells me the presence of microorganisms that are known as coliforms. And coliforms are actually intestinal microorganisms. So you ask yourself, microorganisms that are found in the intestine. So that's my market. And you can see also that from my observation, I actually use a data logger, which is able to take notice of the environmental conditions, giving a huge data. So what I was looking out for was the temperature and then the humidity. You can see that as temperature increased, the coliform count was also increasing all across. However, you can see that from the greenhouse, what you observe is that the coliform count is lower, or it did much better than those at the market. So still with my category of tomatoes, this is how the tomato vendors at the market site sort the tomatoes in order to preserve them. So we have big ripe and then it goes on. And then this is also for the greenhouse. What they do here is that they do not want some sort of contamination, but then it's not the best, as you can see. So I bought my tomatoes, as I said earlier, and then looked at what was happening as the day progressed. So from my diagrams, when you look at day 4, you could see deterioration happening here. And then at the market side, because of the exposure of these tomatoes to anything, what I noticed even on the day 5 was that there was some sort of rabbit or rodent bite happening with the tomato. Same for day 9 too. And as you can see from day 5, the physical deterioration is still going on, and you can see this whitish sort of growth, and I believe these are fungi that were growing there. And then the tomatoes were also losing water, or the moisture content was increasing at the same for vendor C, vendor D. This is the mall, and then this is the greenhouse. So some results that I obtained from my analysis. So what I observed was that even from the first day, you could see D, so vendor A, B, C actually represents the market. D represents the mall, and then E represents the greenhouse. So you can actually observe that even from the first day, the vendor A, B, C had coliform counts that were higher, which does not conform to the standard coliform forming unit for every sample. But then the greenhouse and then the mall perform way better. These are the greenhouse and then the mall. I also looked at the fecal coliforms count to check whether microorganisms that cause fecal pollution or have some sort of association with feces were present. I moved on to look at the aerobic mesophilic counts, that's mesophiles, and microorganisms that are able to survive in temperatures within 20 to 45. So I looked at the count, and still with the same score, you can observe that the greenhouse and then the mall will actually perform much more better. And then I also have the staphylococci or bacilli count. This is to tell you that Staph aureus is that has the ability to cause infections or respiratory infections. So whilst you are consuming these tomatoes that you bought fresh or spoiled, you're actually predisposing or exposing yourselves to these microorganisms. The same for the fungi count. So fungi, as you know, we have yeast and then molds. So when you buy bread, you put it down for a long time, you realize some sort of growth on them. These are microorganisms and these are fungi. So I looked at the count still. And these are the percentages that I observed sampling 90 tomatoes or working on 90 of them. To move on, you could see this is for my chemical analysis. And what I observed is that as the days progressed, the moisture content of the tomatoes increased, and this could be as a result of deterioration or the tomatoes. So the water content was increasing, vitamin C or other nutrients were also going away as the days progressed. The weight of the tomatoes were also decreasing as the days progressed. Also, I noticed that the glucose levels were also decreasing. That's the sugars present. The sugars present were being broken down by some of the microorganisms. Also, the vitamin C. Vitamin C is very, very essential for us, especially being in this COVID time. However, because of these exposure, these tomatoes to the atmosphere at the market size or any other place, the vitamin C that you should access, you do not get the full amount. Also, finally, the pH was also increasing. So as a scientist, you do not just say that these microorganisms are present and then you just go away. You are supposed to verify. So as you can see, this is my Staph aureus. stuff comes in clusters like grapes. So microscopically, I identified that. Then the bacilli, so this is for stuff, then the bacilli species. The bacilli species are rod-like gram-positive microorganisms, and these actually came with endospores, telling you that spores are able to proliferate or grow at peppered temperatures. When they get their heat, they can survive there.
1 minute, please, Abigail.
Yes, please. I did same for gram-negative bacteria that were present, and I confirmed these with API results as well. So these are the different fungi colonies that I identified on my tomatoes. So you just buy tomato that is fresh, it is spoiled, you'll find these different microorganisms growing in them or fungi contaminants growing in them. And you ask yourself, what are you actually? Okay, so still microscopically, as a scientist, I did the spores that were present. And I'll say that what I observed was that the tomatoes that were sold at the market had more microorganisms than those sold at the greenhouse. And also as the days progressed, what you will notice was that the vitamin C, which is essential for our immune systems, the glucose levels were also decreased. So thank you very much. Let's patronize healthy foods and not just go in for cheap foods.
Thanks so much, Abigail. And I think the reflections on the scope of examination here, from microorganisms to macroeconomics, is always exciting to me. And I think in our discussion, we're going to speak a bit about what the implications of those chemical analyses are. Changing locations, I'd like to invite Sean Ali Mohammadi to reflect on the process of developing an urban garden experiment in Cape Town. Please take it away, Sean.
Thanks, Paul. And hi, everyone. It's great to be here with you all today. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. There we go. So I'll jump right into it. My thesis was entitled Explorations of Inclusive Food Flows in the City of Cape Town. And my supervisors were Paul and Sandra. And just to provide a little bit of a context, I won't go too deeply into it, as Mercy and Sandra already touched on the dynamics of the contemporary food system and the various social and environmental challenges that it finds itself in. In terms of social dynamics, we've got the second urbanization wave that's unfolding across African and Asian cities, which is placing huge amounts of pressure on finite resources. Additionally, food insecurity, malnutrition, stunting, wasting, and diet-related non-communicable diseases is still persisting and is on the rise in Africa, particularly affecting women and children. The food system also contributes towards the transgression of multiple planetary boundaries. And unlike other urban resources such as water and energy and waste, it's difficult to capture data on food flows because a lot of this information is held by the private sector, such as supermarkets, which have rapidly proliferated across the whole continent and particularly in Cape Town as well. Yeah, food flows are also, they move through informal networks. Many residents in Cape Town access fresh produce through informal vendors, which also makes it challenging to capture the data on food flows. So the research objectives of my master's were firstly to explore the synergies between the urban metabolism concept and the food system discourse. And secondly, to visualize key spatial dynamics of the city of Cape Town, food's metabolism. And thirdly, to explore how COVID-19 impacted people's engagements with the food system. My research strategy looked as follows, and began with the preliminary preliminary study, and flowed through to a research proposal where I conducted a literature review, examining key concepts in the field, and I then did interviews. This information was transcribed, coded, and I also built a vertical garden, which I'll touch on later. Then I did my analysis and research and conclusion. So a bit more on the research methodology. This was a qualitative study and involved 3 sub-approaches. So literature review, where I examined key concepts such as urbanization, urbanism, and food systems. And I also did online video calls, which was a narrative inquiry into different participants' perceptions of the Cape Town food system and their engagements. And then thirdly, my own immersion in a contemporary social and environmental movement called the Cape Town Together Food Growers Initiative. So the research outcomes, I could speak about this for probably years, but in essence, what I thought was the most interesting for the first research objective, the synergies between the city and the food system, is food is really a huge part of cities. And by studying food flows, we can understand more about other urban resources such as water, energy, transport, shelter, housing, and also waste and sanitation, as about half of waste in cities is organic waste, much of which comes from the food system. And then for my second research objective, which was really a big theme, and I think it's important to note that it was difficult to explore this properly just in a master's thesis. But essentially, what I found was food had been treated as rural and rather not as urban, although most food consumption takes place in urban areas. And therefore, there was kind of this perception of food as being outside of the city, and is land, agricultural land on the hinterlands of cities is often targeted by property developers, which is quite problematic for food security, as that extends the food supply chain. And the state's commissioned agriculture land report for Cape Town was found to be severely outdated and needs to be urgently updated to include potential urban areas such as schools, where significant food production can actually take place and supply or contribute towards children feeding schemes. And then the third research objective is what I'm actually going to be zooming in on today, because that speaks towards informality and COVID-19 and how informal food vendors were able to respond towards the challenges that were present in the food system. So informality during, or the dynamics between informal food networks and COVID-19 varied throughout the research period, which was from March towards August. In the initial phases of lockdown, which was a restriction of trade for food traders, and also restriction of movement, so people weren't able to sell their food, and it was reported that their businesses were decimated and hit rock bottom. This problem was compounded by the fact that the state provided little support or business remuneration for losses that were incurred due to the state lockdown. And then in level 4, traders were allowed to resume, and they were deemed as essential workers. And there was this interesting emergence of community action networks that were connecting different communities and sharing resources to address challenges around food and also environmental challenges in Cape Town. So one particularly interesting example is the Cape Town Together Food Growers Initiative, which was a collection of food system advocates that were working towards building a more inclusive food system and more environmentally friendly food system. And this carried out throughout varying levels, and still a strong movement that's going on today. Yeah, so this group mainly organized themselves on virtual platforms, and after its inception in March, it quickly grew to about 2,000 members, which is where it's on today. The group embraces agroecology, which is nature-based farming, and food and seed sovereignty. It was found that the group was active in more than 20 different communities across Cape Town, and it is coordinated by a volunteer admin team that sets up various other subgroups, such as a seed bank where people trade indigenous seeds, and a land liaison task team to engage local governments, a water task team to do a similar thing, a media task team to get the message out there of sustainable food systems, um, and yeah, various other groups such as a co-learning group and a Zlato volunteers group, which I'll speak about a bit later. This is one example of a member's garden that I visited. I recorded about 100 different gardens that were created over my research period. This is another particularly interesting and inspiring food garden that was set up by a member, Paul McAvoy, who's a principal of Factorton Primary School. And he makes use of a variety of growing methods such as hydroponics and vertical, what they call grow pros, which is recycled paint drums. This unit also embraces a vermicomposting chamber for recycling of organic waste. This is the aquaponics unit that the school used to grow leafy vegetables and leafy greens to support the school feeding. It was noted that the school struggled to look after the garden during hard lockdown because of restriction of movement, and that led to loss in some of the produce. And this was the vertical garden experiment that I conducted as a result of the challenges that are present in the food system, and also from my engagements with the Cape Town Together Food Growers Initiative, Factorton Primary School, and with funding from the Kritiski Rotary Club. And basically the idea was to take old vehicle tires and modify them to drill holes inside and stack them vertically on top of one another. And then on the inside, have a vermicomposting tube to do or to recycle of organic waste or to create worm tea, which is organic fertilizer to help restore degraded soils. So this doesn't only provide food, but it provides the children a good deal of engagement with sustainable transitions and healthy living. An additional experiment was almost a social experiment, and that emerged as a result of my engagement with the Cape Town food growers and also with a preschool in Dunoon, where we got together some funding to plant some fruit trees and vegetables. And I started a food growers group for the community. It's increased to about 50 members, and it caught the attention of local and provincial governments. And I just found it interesting to see how the group was then used by these different governmental departments to communicate awareness about public health, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. And also the Department of Transport actually connected to some of the members and donated a couple of bicycles to the group. So in conclusion, in reflecting on all of this and the significance that I find particularly interesting is that informal food actors are perhaps better positioned to address contextual, social, and ecological challenges surrounding food systems. As they're on the ground and they know the challenge better than anyone else because they live it. And informal food systems such as the Cape Town Together Food Growers Initiative was able to advance a multiplicity of sustainable development goals. And it was also able to support local change agents and social entrepreneurs through the system I mentioned earlier called Slido, which is a blockchain system that connects funders for community development projects with volunteers and rewards the volunteers for their time with redeemable food vouchers, electricity, data, and airtime. And then lastly, by supporting informal food networks, we can help address social issues and environmental issues, and also create inclusive economic opportunities in the rapidly growing sustainable development economy. There are my resources, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Sean. I see some questions have come into the question box and into the chat, so I just want to remind everyone to please share any further questions that can guide some of our conversation after our final presentation here. I'd like to welcome Jahan to reflect on some of the photographic processes and what some of the imagery and ideas were that were emerging from the process.
Thanks so much, Paul. I'm very excited to be here, and welcome to everybody. So I'm going to share some reflections and insights from the Hidden Flows photo showcase and some of the themes that emerged, and as well as talk a little bit about why this form is really important for policy, for urban policy, and important for inclusive urban change as a means of generating knowledge. So perhaps a little bit of background. So as Paul and Sandra mentioned, it was really, the intention was really to understand how different ways of knowing and alternative forms of knowledge generation can really provide rich insights into our urban environments and specifically in African cities. And so really how this can play a role in policy discussions and kind of having conversations with policymakers. And then in turn, inform policy in that way. So through this process, photography has been such a useful tool because it really allowed for a wide reach of participants. And so we were able to get or to have participation from all over Africa and African cities. And it really provided the opportunity for citizens to engage in this process, and for photographers and for artists to really get involved in this process of documenting their urban environments and their lived experiences. And so it really allowed for this multiplicity of voices in this research process. So as I've mentioned, it highlighted some of the realities on the ground, and it really provided insights into how resources flow in our cities. And this specific photographic dialogue focused on 5 different resource flows. So it's water, energy, waste, food, and how people play a role. And as Paul mentioned, this is very important because so much of what happens in African cities is informal. So it doesn't always, it's not always seen and it's not recognized. So this was a way to really visualize these realities and to piece this together and to tell a bit of a story. So the Hidden Flows process was twofold. We were able to crowdsource photographs through an Instagram competition, and we also were able to commission photographers from all over Africa to provide very specific inputs on different thematic areas or resource flows. And then the second process was to have a photographic dialogue. And so we've included some city officials from Kumasi as well as Cape Town, as well as the photographers that were involved, the artists, the general practitioners, and anyone that really was interested in this process and using photography. And so from this, I'm going to share my screen, and we managed to develop quite an impressive mural board as a way to engage in conversation with participants. And I'm going to take you through some of the themes that have emerged from that. So we started this Hidden Flow process about a year ago, I think in July, and during that time it was the COVID and the COVID process and how this really impacted our cities. And so what the showcase really did was to highlight how cities are responding and how people are responding. And so there was quite a number of images that came in around how food has been distributed and how these community groups and civil society groups have really played such a huge role in providing food. So this is one of the really interesting insights, I think, from the photographs that came through. Another one was sort of, I think photographers were really great in also providing a series of photographs on different aspects. And this one really shows the kind of food that is produced. You know, there's a wide range of nutritious foods that people are selling in the markets. It also showed a little bit about storage and potentially the lack of infrastructure and how this impacts on the selling of food in the markets. There was also a question in our reflection and discussion where people asked, well, where does the food come from? Is it locally grown? How is it distributed? Where does it travel from? So really provide an opportunity to engage in some of these questions. And I think it was really important also to see that women play such a huge role in food distribution and providing access to people. So, and it really provides them with a livelihood. So it's really looking at these elements that can support or that can feed into policy that way. Where's number 3? This is also really interesting. So this is from one of our commissioned photographers, and it really tells a story about distribution and this urban-rural linkage, and how this was done in Bukavu, and how Lake Kivu plays such a huge role in transporting food from the countryside to the urban areas. So this is really, shows distribution, shows. Someone asked a little bit about, you know, the intergenerational aspect of the markets and livelihoods and who's involved in this distribution. And yeah, potentially also how lack of infrastructure and how we can provide more of this in these spaces, in these very lively spaces. So this was also from one of our commissioned photographers that really beautifully depicts how food brings people together. And this was also shot, I suppose, during the COVID time, and how people still found a way to gather in the street with, you know, food as the main source of creating that connection. And so it speaks to that sociality and the culture of food. And so really thinking about how our public spaces can support more of this and more of the sociality and connection during these times. And I think it was also interesting that it was, you know, night picture. So it also just shows how our cities operate in the evening, and all the other infrastructure that accompanies that. So I mean, this was also quite a lot of indication of who makes resources, where do these resources come from, who moves these resources, and who sells it. So, I mean, we spoke a little bit about energy and the charcoal, and so how people have derived their livelihoods from supply of the energy. Waste pickers also play a huge role in the recycling economy and the circularity economy in our cities. And I think the story on the left tells a little bit of gives a little bit of an indication of, you know, people, waste pickers don't always have the infrastructure and the storage or the ways and the means of moving to be able to transport things. So really on one trip, it's transporting everything that you can in that process. And so how can our waste management systems and our infrastructure for the support waste pickers and in the informal economy? And I think something that also came through quite strongly was, you know, the role of children and how they also play a role in moving water in our cities, and the impact this has on, you know, how they access education so that was also quite interesting that came out. This was also another interesting one because it really showed ways how people and citizens are making electricity available and making them more accessible and affordable. And so this really also speaks to electricity as a service. So people are providing charging stations for mobile phones, for whatever electronic devices they have. And so it's really interesting to see how people derive livelihoods from these processes. And, you know, this speaks to also, this photograph was taken in a taxi rank, and it also speaks to sort of the intersection of people, livelihoods, and these spaces where there's a lot of movement of people, and how people have use these spaces for informal trade and for trading as such, and to also plays a role. These spaces also play a role in livelihood production. And then a big theme, I think, that came really through all these photographs is really how people, people as infrastructure, and really how people play such a huge role in moving resources, in making them accessible and affordable, and in the process sustaining their own lives and deriving economic opportunity from these resources. And so really looking at the gaps within in potentially the lack of what's not in their cities, and making the most of it. And I think it's also interesting, yeah, I think the photographs on the right side, bottom right, just shows, you know, how food also moves within our cities and how people transport these. So yeah, so there's quite a lot of, there was another one that I actually wanted to show, and I think it's really about how people connect with their spaces and connection with infrastructure and space, and how people are using these different opportunities to sell food, different spaces within road space to create informal training. So really how they're adapting to their spaces and playing a role in doing that. And so yeah, what we can see from this, I think, is that when we speak about policy, when we speak about policy, and when we speak about how this can inform policy, is really to use these kinds of images to interrogate a little bit more about what's happening on the ground, and to use this medium as a conversation starter with policymakers, to understand things a little bit more in detail. And I mean, I think what we can see is also how this really tells a rich story about our urban realities, which can, in that way, enhance the data that's already coming from our more formal and more measurable data. So how this can really enhance that. I think Sandra spoke a little bit about the interconnectedness of our services, and I think this photo series really shows that, the impact of waste and infrastructure on environmental hazards, and how people are responding to this. And also the other side of it, and how waste can be a resource, and how it is creating jobs and livelihoods in that way. So it really shows really interesting the complexity and the interconnectedness of that. So I think in terms of thinking about policy and how this can influence or play a role and enhance in policy, is really in recognizing, I think these pictures show us that we need to recognize that not all informality is bad, and there's a lot of interesting things and ingenious ways that people are adapting and creating responses to things that they do not have. And so we really need to recognize that and enhance and ways in which we can intervene that support these processes and support these people. I think another thing that's interesting is that people are going to always adapt to their needs. And so this will also change over time. So just because there's an intervention that's being put in place for a specific challenge, it's always important to understand what the outcomes are and how people have adapted to this. So in that way, I think something that came out of the reflections and this chat during our photographic dialogue was around how policy can be flexible and can have a buffer for change, or to include some of these, how people adapt. And then I think the last thing that I wanted to add is just that alternative knowledge does enhance other ways of knowing, scientific forms, as well as formal research, as well as policy briefs and other kind of recommendations. And I think it can really provide quite a rich story and a narrative around realities on the ground. So I think, that's all from my side.
Thanks, Jan, for sharing your reflections. I think there your closing point on the complementarity of different types of knowledge and different ways of knowing is the theme that we've been exploring today. So in our closing 20 minutes, I'd like to invite our team to turn on your videos and have a few reflections on what's been shared today. So if I can invite Sandra, Merci, Abigail, Sean. And before we move just to some of the questions that have been posed in the Q&As, if we could just do a round of what has struck you by what our colleagues have each presented as, here we go, as important for your own work. So what linkages do you see with what's been presented? And maybe what is the one takeaway that you would wish to pursue further in those lines? So maybe if we go the same order that we presented, and I can put Sandra on the spot to start us off. Sandra, and then Merci, then Abigail, then Sean, then Jahan.
Thank you very much, everyone. And it's actually exciting reflecting on all these different components of our work. I think yesterday when we were having the prep session, something else struck me, but this morning it's a different thing altogether. You know, connecting Abigail, Sean, and Jahan's work about resources and how infrastructure availability and even access is key to how all these resources are made available. For example, thinking about the markets and how, due to the lack of storage facilities, the tomatoes or the produce are going bad. And even thinking about how these infrastructure systems is not just only for food, but even for lights, for waste pickers, and for other resource distributions. It makes me wonder and reflect about the depth, and the bigger problem of infrastructure in African cities, and probably the need to look more, into detail and in depth about these systems and how they are provided. Thank you.
You're on mute. Paul.
Merci.
Yes, I think it's been an exciting afternoon. Trying to connect the science that we do and then the more like the anthropological activities, and then bringing them together and making sense out of it. I think what struck me was I think that the first time I'm actually what he has done, and that's actually has become of interest to me, because if I look at the analysis that we have done here, you realize that samples taken from the greenhouse very well. I mean, it has microbial contamination anyway, but the levels of contamination is minimal. If the kind of farm tool they are using, if it's workable, I'm sure they are going to produce better vegetables from the kind of farm tools that they are using. And so I think that is the highlight for me.
Abigail?
Yeah, Abigail, say something.
Okay, so I also on Sean's presentation, where he was speaking about COVID or COVID, and then I sort of liken it to the fact that, especially in this COVID time, where you need to access or take in vitamin C to boost your immune system. However, due to the actions of these microorganisms, okay, we actually need to work on the vegetables that are in the market. Even if they do not have the best storage, they should be educated in such a way that when we go to patronize it, we can get the full nutrients that we need as humans. So that's for me a takeaway. Thank you.
Thanks. Sean, your reflection on other inputs?
So yeah, what really stood out for me was for Abigail's presentation, the relationship between storage infrastructure and the change in nutrients and vitamins over time. And, I got excited about thinking of the possibilities of, offering low-tech passive storage infrastructure to increase the lifespan and mineral contents of food. And there's some interesting things that I would love to share with you. And regarding the different research methodologies, I thought it was very interesting to see how, all of these different perspectives from the, microbial lens and then, more social anthropological lens, and then through a visual exploration, how all of these perspectives can come together. They really give us a real-time understanding and a holistic picture about our urban realities, as Jihan said.
Thanks. Jihan?
Thanks. I think for me, what struck me is that, and I've said this before, is how really people play a role. And I think, if we're gonna design policy that is inclusive, it's really an understanding about or turning the research into how people experience things, and really understanding the different needs of people within these systems as well. So I think for me, what struck with this whole process and everyone's presentations and sort of how these connect to each other is really about putting the people back into the research and really understanding that part more, so that we can put forward more inclusive interventions.
Thanks, John. What struck me as a project participant, but also in facilitating this, is the idea of time as a resource. And in everyone's presentations, we've touched on it slightly. So, since Sandra speaking about access to basic resources, and thinking, to connect it to Jahan's visuals of people having to walk long distances for water, or having to wait a water truck to arrive, the time it takes for you to get your basic requirements can be used for other activities, such as recreation and socializing or other economic benefit. And so a lot of this is the question about how do we increase more choice for people to get quality resources, but how do we increase the amount of time that people have for their own pursuits, and seeing the simple question of the simple point of adding electricity into someone's home, or good lighting energy, suddenly extends the day into the night, and there's opportunity to continue work in the evenings, to read and learn, things like that. To Abigail's point of time, I mean, we saw visually how your increase in microorganisms went up over time. And so how do we give our vendors more time for the food to stay at high quality? And there's Sean's connection to adding an experiment, or adding low-cost infrastructure to do so, is a welcome reflection on that. And not to get too researchy or in other words, but then the question of megatrends over time, and how sudden shocks to the system force us to deal with long-term systems of change. And so Sean's reflection on the community action networks that have emerged to deal with a very direct response. People are hungry, we need to feed them, to realizing that this is a much larger system that's going to take a lot more work, and what is their role in intervening over time. So I think it's quite a nice interstitial sort of question there. But just to offer time to reflect on the questions that have come in, Proteus has asked, what are the possible solutions to overcome the challenges obtained during inadequate storage? While in Africa, the skills of storage and handling are still not efficient. Merci and Abigail, if you could reflect on what are your direct approaches to improving storage, I think both technologically, but also in practice. What have you been engaging with?
Yes, right, thank you very much. Yes, I looked at the question. I think the basic rule of what we need to do is to continuously educate the women or the market players, because the microorganisms we see growing on the vegetables has really not been subjected to the tomatoes when they come to the lab. This means that when we pick the tomatoes from the market, it's already contaminated. And the contamination is coming from the handling and the storage. And it is because they put vegetables together and then they keep them at one place. They add all sorts of things. I'm sure we look at some of the pictures, the rags they have used. Some of them sprinkle the vegetables with water. These are not any clean water. I mean, they are eating and then they will not even wash. They are using their hands to eat and they will use their hands to pick it. And so they need to be educated that you are selling this to you as the seller, you are eating some actually, and you are also consuming it. And if you look at the range of organisms that we saw, definitely we'll have a lot of them that are harmful. So we are eating and we are eating sickness and we are kind of initiating our own deaths in a way. So we need to educate them. There's not nothing we can do but to educate them. We should also let them understand how periodic cleaning of the market is, how important it is to do periodic cleaning. We are authorities. It's one of the things that we talk about, that they should inspect. They should keep on inspecting the various facilities the women are using, so that they know that if I don't clean my premises or I'm storing my vegetables, the law will catch up on me and I will pay a fine. Nobody wants to do that, or probably I'll be taken to court or arrested. So I think educating the women and then ensuring that there's cleaning. Thank you.
Mercy, to add a follow-on, you've got a stakeholder workshop coming up soon,
Yes.
and that's taking the research into, back to the people who've been participating. What are the aims there, and what do you hope to achieve with that?
With the stakeholder engagement. Okay, so I think first of all, we are going to do same. We are going to present our data, our findings to the, so these stakeholders actually are the assemblymen, also people managing the assembly, the unit committee, market leaders. So earlier we had engaged with the market queens, but we have assembly people that are managing the markets. So for the municipality that we have been working within, we have sampled about 5 different markets. I mean, these are smaller markets, but I mean, we get various vegetables from. So we want to engage with them. They should know what we have seen, the data we found out. And then from that sharing of data or findings, we will discuss with them what solutions to help us manage some of these if there's any word like not quality, right? What is affecting the quality of the vegetables on the market? And then we will also find out from them what they think are the challenges that probably is preventing them, because these actors actually have power over the markets. So what is preventing them from ensuring at least some hygienic protocols in the markets? And then we come to a common conclusion. We agree on the way forward to at least ensure that the market where we picked our samples from can be a model market for us. And then we'll follow up on them moving on.
Great. We wish you well in following that process forward.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
A question posed by Joseph to Sean is, what about the concern for socio-ecological trade-offs, and where should the emphasis be? And I suppose talking about food security for people's well-being versus environmental well-being. If you could reflect on that, and then Sandra, if you could add your reflections, given that your work also looked at trade-offs.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because there are so many trade-offs in the current configuration of the food system, social, environmental, but also economic trade-offs. And I think COVID-19 has now showed us clearer than ever before that the food system is it's a facade. And I think that presents the opportunity to actually move towards a more inclusive food system. And I think you can be socially inclusive and environmentally regenerative at the same time. I don't think we have to trade them off. I think they can work together quite well. Yeah, those are my reflections.
Thanks. Sandra, to add?
Thank you, Paul. So I think that for me, actually the way to go is to look broadly at these systems as interconnected and how one actually achieving a good outcome in one affects the other. And whether this interaction of these outcomes is either an enabling interaction or an inhibiting interaction to the other system. And I think that even though we are faced with these trade-offs, there could be bargains where we try to build in resilience in how we address each of these interactions, and whether it's a negative or a positive interactions. So I think it's more about thinking about building resilience, using indigenous knowledge if it's available, because some of these systems have always been there, and how best we can, minimize these trade-offs so that it's not huge or provide a restriction to achieving either food or environmental welfare. Thank you.
Thanks. I think a problem statement when we think about African urbanism is how do we improve quality of life for people? We've got very unequal societies, many societies very deprived of basic resources. So how do we do that in the most environmentally regenerative manner? And there are many approaches there, either through social engagement or using the right technology. And through a lot of the conversations we've had around resources over the course of the year as part of Rise Africa and other programs have pointed to the idea, well, how do we improve choice and agency to take choice? Because most people will choose something which is good for their well-being, their neighbors' well-being, and the environment, if those choices exist and are reachable. I see a hand from Kimera Henry. I'll welcome you into the conversation in a moment. I just want to pose the one question that was directed at Jahan. You've collected and shown many hidden images around African cities that shows what Africa needs to do to achieve green cities. So what are the strategies that have been voiced to alleviate these challenges? A big question.
That is a very big question. And I mean, I think there are many strategies, and I think what we shouldn't do is apply a blanket approach to how we respond to challenges, because every context is different. And every challenge is different, I guess. And I think, something that came out of our reflections and the dialogues and people engaging with us is that, how do we get a bit more comfortable with informality? How do we support the good things that come from informality? There's always this need to formalize everything, to create plans that formalize, and is this the best approach? So maybe it's really spending more time trying to understand what the challenges are, trying to understand how the informal systems, the structures that are creating these, the networks that are a part of this, and then finding little gaps and aspects of these to enhance and to support and to build up in that way. And so, I mean, something we've seen a lot of the interconnectedness, and I think this is something that we really speak about quite often, but it's like, how do we integrate approaches, and how do we integrate and collaborate more? Because a lot of these things, we've seen road space that is being used for markets and for traveling and for pedestrians. So for example, mobility planning goes hand in hand with urban planning. And if you're providing road space and allocating road space for informal trading, then potentially we can provide infrastructure like waste management. We can provide water management and drainage, and potentially that could solve some of the issues around the waste management in those areas and things. So we've seen a little bit about women in the markets, and so how does some of our economic funding go towards supporting these women in their pursuit for economic freedom and economic opportunities? And so, I mean, Paul mentioned, like, you know, putting electricity in the house gives you more time, but putting water points closer potentially has the impact of, you know, having kids being able to go to school and getting an education and changing those systems. So these are all very integrated. So yeah, I mean, it's a big question, and I think these are just questions that need to be asked constantly and be reflected on by, you know, multitude of people who are part of policymaking.
So I think that's a really useful provocation for how we should close the webinar, is do a round of what is the next question you want to answer, and what do you want to explore next, given that this project is coming to a close, and as Jahan's illustrated, it has emerged, more questions have emerged from it. I see Kimera Henry, you lowered your hand. Maybe if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand again and I'll invite you in. Otherwise, I think we'll close the session for the day. Okay, please unmute and share your question.
Thank you very much, Paul, and I would like to thank the panel. It's quite a rich sharing, and it brings in very key cross-fertilization, the informal and formal approaches towards sustainable foods and really in the urban setup. One of the things that I've appreciated out of here, there is an element that has continuously going in referring to regulatory frameworks. And I find that regulatory frameworks exist in every country that is in there, and whichever stakeholder has been checked out. The photography shows how the duty bearers have failed the citizens. When you look at how transportation of goods, foods, display of foods in markets, all the frameworks exist. And I would like to commend Abigail's colleague. I didn't get her name when she was talking about training. The next move, all about urban sustainable foods, would be awareness, training, and then advocacy for the regulatory frameworks to be implemented. However much we call them absolute, but the elements, like even Sean brings in the different aspects, Sandra brings in energy where it is polluting and bringing reciprocal challenges. The clean energy is expensive for majority of the low-income earners. It will be policy that will make it cheap for them. Let's say removing taxes from the cheap energy that provides good health. Examples are many, but the most important is not to monetize life and not to say we need to see economic growth and development. Why don't we see human growth and development? Can't we put face onto all these economic terms? I just loved the photography, and it is something that we can use when we are advocating to show that all these mechanisms that we have can make these lives better. I'm a consumer advocate, and whenever we tell consumers, look out for safe food, but the consumers are not inspectors, they are not scientists, they are not chemists. They are only chemists when they cook food to eat it, and they will say, this doesn't meet my test. The obligated person is who takes on the taxpayers' money, employed to make sure that whatever gets off the boat on Lake Kivu at Bukavu is well handled, and it goes onto the market. The markets are cleaned. Frameworks are in place. Every day, clean up your market, collect the garbage, cross-contamination. But it is unfortunate that monetarization has ended up collecting dues from market vendors rather than providing services to the market vendors and endangering consumers. I will end with that, but this has been quite a good expose, and it is something that we need to continuously do, the cross-fertilization to improve lives. As I always say, food is healthcare and medicine is Medicare. It was a pleasure joining you, colleagues.
Thank you very much for your input. And just to highlight that really strong point, we're busy celebrating how informality is ingenuity and how it's coming to fill gaps. And we haven't spoken about your point there, which is the duty bearers failing to offer that service. And I think that's really important to think about, where the duty bearers and the ingenuitive citizens meet. So thank you. I feel that's a really lovely closing point. And just to cycle through our presenters on one, what is the next question for you, or the next action for you to take forward? So let's go in reverse this time. Jahan, then Sean, and so
on. I think the next question, and I think what this research project really did was, there's different forms of knowledge and reflection and stuff. And so how do we create more of that? How do we create more spaces in our cities for reflection, for conversation, that's not finger pointing or anything, but that's, conducive to finding solutions that are innovative. And so what do we need to do that? What do we need to achieve that? And I think that's really, really important for going forward and producing cities that are inclusive and sustainable.
Thanks, John. Sean?
I think for me, there's many questions, but one that sticks out most, perhaps it's my BCom background, is we know that there's many transitions that are happening in the food system, and we're potentially moving towards a more inclusive food system. How do we leverage funding for this to happen, or where are fruitful places to engage so that the people on the ground can actually do these things? I think that's something I'd like to explore next.
Thanks, Sean. Abigail, then Messi. You're on mute.
So I think for me, I'm thinking, I'm just asking myself, from what I have seen, space is a big issue at the market. So probably or the one who is selling is squeezed for space. And so if I'm selling onions, tomato, okra, spinach, that is the space I have. So I have to use water, and it's dirty water. How water? So I mean, how do we improve the market infrastructure? Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks. Abigail?
So I'm looking at how can you also change their mindsets? Because if you look at the tomatoes that's already coming to the market, some would already, go in for the one that they call it it's bruised, it's punctured, has a lot of microorganisms. They will just go in for it. So I asked myself that how can we change their mindset, and then also to let them know the diseases that, or food poisoning diseases or illnesses that
Thanks. And Sarah?
Thanks, Paul. So for me, I'm actually thinking about this coalition of academics or TD researchers that we've built and how to use this coalition to bring about change. For example, I'm thinking right now about, oh, wow, we need an architect in our team, you know, if you want to change the markets and how these markets are structured. And I'm also thinking about the possibility of designing what Sean proposed, you know, low-scale storage facilities for these vendors. It's a solution, but it's just a small start solution from the academic and the research perspective. And from the perspective of the stakeholders, how can we encourage them, you know, or motivate them to do their work? Because some of them we know do not do their work, which is why the frameworks are not being implemented and the activities of the women are not being regulated. So how do we motivate these civil officers to actually do their work more? I think that's where I am moving towards. So how to make policy workers do their work and then how to expand this coalition of actors. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So I think that's a grand closing. And we've been prompted in the chat to share presentations and recordings, which we shall do. A big thank you to all our attendees for staying with us and adding your thoughts. It's helped to enrich the conversation. And we hope that you'll continue participating until the end of African City Food Month by sharing on social media the activities that you're taking to improve your food systems and continuing the advocacy work to show that local governments are really important drivers of food system change. As in partnership, of course, given our topic today with food system stakeholders. So thank you very much. I wish you all well and stay safe and see you soon. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.